Let's start from the beginning here. So, we're very honored and pleased to have Steve McIntosh with us today, writer, philosopher, entrepreneur, businessman, one of the leading cutting edge thinkers in evolutionary philosophy and spiritual philosophy in the world today. Steve, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. True honor and pleasure to be talking with you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Emanuel. It's a pleasure to be with you too.
All right. Well, I know we've got a lot to talk about today. I sent Steve some preliminary ideas, and he said, that'd be great. I hope we have 3 days to discuss it all. So we'll try and keep it within the hour here as much as possible. But Steve, before you became a spiritual philosopher, you had quite a distinguished career. You studied law, were a lawyer for one of the largest law firm in California. You're a businessman, an inventor. You founded the company Now and Zen. You were an executive for Celestial Seasonings Tea Company. How did you come from all that rather conventional world to spiritual philosophy? Can you give us a little insight on?
Sure. Well, I started with spiritual philosophy in a sense and kind of came full circle back to it after several decades. I grew up in Los Angeles. I was born in 1960. And by the time I was about 13 years old, I became very attracted to the counterculture, right? The last dying embers of the 60s movement. And I felt that I had missed a kind of a renaissance that I felt like I wanted to be a hippie, but I was too young. And that began in the 70s, an interest in the periods of history that have experienced a fluorescence, right? Whether it be the Renaissance in ancient Europe or the Enlightenment or even the 60s, there have been distinct periods in history when culture went through a period of growth. And I had a sense, a deep intuition that I was called to participate in an event in history like that. And that was what my life was really about.
Right.
And in the 70s, I was very drawn to progressive spirituality, right? The term New Age no longer captures it and has become somewhat of a term of derision. But in the 70s, alternative spirituality was just coming to its first fluorescence as much of the energy of the 60s was sort of channeled into alternative spirituality in the 70s. And I really formed my identity around wanting to participate in progressive spirituality. I was curious about it in a way that led me to believe that this was part of my own larger purpose. But by the late 70s, I realized that I couldn't just be countercultural, that I needed some establishment credentials, right, and some ability to influence society. So I went to business school with the idea of being an entrepreneur. But that led me to realize that I needed some kind of a graduate degree. I didn't want to get an MBA or study business too extensively. So I went to law school. Then after law school, I had enough wherewithal. I traveled to Tibet for a month and I kind of re-established my spiritual seeking. But then I went into law just to sort of experience that. I did business for a while. But in 1995, here in Boulder, where I live, there really felt like a kind of a spiritual renaissance, like this next phase of cultural fluorescence that I had been looking to and trying to position myself to participate in since the 70s seemed to be coming online, right? In the 90s, there was a real fluorescence of progressive spirituality as New Age books became the publishing industry's largest category by far, dwarfing every other category of book sales. It seemed like a New Age bookstore was opening, in every town. And so this was a heady time. And here in Boulder, I felt as though this renaissance was dawning and I wanted to participate in it. So I started a company with the idea of creating artifacts that would be artistic reflections of this cultural fluorescence. But by the late 90s, I and many of my friends here in Boulder, we began to become disillusioned with progressive spirituality, kind of a restlessness with its magical thinking and its intense commercialism, and the ways in which, although it was certainly fulfilling the needs of many who were participating in the various strains of progressive spirituality, there was also a way in which it was failing to provide the larger spiritual leadership that I think our society was really calling for. In other words, it remained, it has remained to this day, very countercultural and sort of marginalized by much of academia, by the mainstream media, by intellectually oriented people. Progressive spirituality, while it continues to have a significant market, I think has diminished somewhat since its last fluorescence in the 90s. Mm-hmm. And so it was around this time of my restlessness with progressive spirituality that I became acquainted with integral philosophy, which was growing out of progressive spirituality, but attempting to transcend it in very important ways by reclaiming some of the wisdom of previous perspectives and previous cultural worldviews. And so this was around 2000. I was invited to join Ken Wilber's Integral Institute, which was based here in Boulder. And I kind of became part of the integral movement there in the early 2000s. But I also realized that I had an independent contribution to make, that I respected Wilber, but I couldn't really become a Wilberian or a follower of Ken Wilber. And so that led, beginning in 2004, to the writing of my first book, which was then published in 2007. And I've been engaged as a contributor and participant in this emerging integral movement, or it's known by a variety of names. Postmodern is another name.
That's a mouthful.
But nevertheless, I realized that my purpose, the gift that I could give, had to do with thinking and writing and being politically active. And so that's sort of been the main focus of my work for the last 15 years.
Yeah, well, it's been some great work that you've done. And first of all, I really appreciate that you had that kind of purposeful spark early on in your life, yet you had the kind of vision and wherewithal to kind of go a practical route and then circle back later on. So very admirable path, Steve. And you really took it all seriously, and we're glad to have you back here in spiritual philosophy.
Well, I never left. I've always been a spy.
Yeah, it was always there. I mean, I've done the same sort of thing my life, so I definitely get that. But yeah, so you published Integral Consciousness, your first book, in 2007 then, and that led on to Evolution's Purpose in 2012, and The Presence of the Infinite in 2015. But as you've been referring here to, you got excited about all of this way back in the 70s, and you've referred to progressive spirituality. You do a great job in your books of kind of defining the different phases of spirituality. But just for our listeners here, basically we have traditional religious spirituality that passed on to what you call progressive spirituality, really the 60s revolution and the New Age. And now we have what you refer to as evolutionary spirituality, which you've bringing us into now. So, I know that you've, as you mentioned here, you had some disappointments with progressive spirituality, and you're trying to make a more complete, integral contribution to it. You want to enlighten us a little bit more on that trajectory of spirituality and how you see it today?
Sure. Well, of course, everyone's familiar with traditional religion, right? That includes, of course, the Judeo-Christian heritage of the West, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, in all the world's great religions, most of which can be traced back to the axial age, right? 500 BC or since then. And religious forms of spirituality continue to supply the worldview for approximately 30% of the American public. And indeed, the achievements of the religious civilizations that preceded modernity are prerequisite to our modern world, right? Even though most people think about how during the Enlightenment we pushed off against feudal forms of government, we beheaded the king, and we embraced reason. And so indeed there was a dialectic or thesis and antithesis between traditional religion and modernity. But modernity was only able to achieve the spectacularly material and tangible results that it's achieved in the world for the last 250 years as a result of building on many of the important accomplishments, carrying forward much of the social capital of traditional religion. And so the establishment of the mainstream world we live in is very much a hybrid of both the rational modern worldview and the foundations of the traditional religious worldview for even those who don't ascribe to a particular form of religion. They're nevertheless living in a civilization that's benefiting from many of the achievements of decency, honesty, respect for authority, even the quest for a purpose in life. These are all important elements of heritage that that have been handed down to us from the accomplishments of our pre-modern ancestors, right? But of course, modernity, since the Enlightenment, again, it's achieved many physical things and many important things that improve the human conditions, like scientific medicine. But modernity, because in some ways its worldview is framed by pushing off against religion, it in a sense, it lacks meaning. In other words, sensitive thinkers, really for the last 150 years, since modernity's ascendancy, have recognized that we couldn't just rest in the modern world, that we needed to reclaim meaning and find a way to re-enchant the universe without regressing to a mythic worldview or without going back to a religious perspective. And so really beginning 150 years ago with Emerson and Thoreau, the transcendentalists, and many other early postmodern thinkers, if you will, or those who were trying to transcend modernity, began looking for alternative forms of spirituality. And they found them most abundantly in Eastern spirituality, right? Hinduism and Buddhism specifically, but also Taoism and Confucianism, and we could name all the Eastern religions that have influenced sensitive thinkers in the West. But this trend of seeking spiritual alternatives really kind of burst upon the scene in a major way in history, and becoming not just an obscure, intellectual specialty, but something that had a market and that was visible to the larger culture. And that, of course, began in the 60s, which matured in the 70s as the birth of alternative spirituality. And we could tick off all the different elements, I try to, in The Presence of the Infinite, my 2015 book, of what constitutes progressive spirituality. But it's not simply the Western Buddhism. It's not simply guru-following practitioners of Advaita Vedanta. There's a way in which all the various forms of progressive spirituality, even though they contradict each other in their spiritual teachings sometimes, nevertheless form a cultural agreement space and a real market. And we can still see plenty of vital artifacts of this culture that continue to this day. Certainly yoga culture, mindfulness culture. There's ways in which the achievements of progressive spirituality have been inculcated into the larger society in sort of watered down forms. But, I think that influence is good, even though, the more stalwart practitioners of progressive spirituality may bemoan, the modernization of things like mindfulness or yoga. I think that any way that progressive spirituality can serve, whether it's in the creation of its own cultural space or in the gradual spiritualization of the mainstream space, I think it's doing important work. So when I talk about the shortcomings of progressive spirituality, I'm not trying to invalidate it or rag on it or create a, progressive spirituality bad, evolutionary spirituality.
We want to include and transcend, right?
Yeah. We want to build, just as these other important societal accomplishments have built on each other, right? When evolution works, there's a structure of emergence where there's a transcendence and inclusion. So if we want to keep from regressing socially, culturally, spiritually, then we do well to recognize and preserve the important accomplishments that have been made along the way by these different phases of spiritual development in Western civilization.
Yeah. And now we're here in evolutionary spirituality. You've said that you're terribly excited about this, as I think many of us at the Global Purpose Movement are, and throughout the world. So we are the Global Purpose Movement. We might start with, is there purpose in the universe? And that's quite a big question in itself, because a lot of material scientists would take objection to that. So is there purpose? I have a sneaking suspicion you'll tell us there is. And And if so, what is that purpose? How can you describe it?
Sure. Well, first, it's important to say that questions of the purpose of the universe are in some ways beyond what humans can know. There's certainly mystery. We can't just declare the purpose of the universe in some overarching, spiritual truth proclamation. Nevertheless, I think it's indisputable that there's purpose in the universe, and that is we all have it. In other words, we get up in the morning partially as a result of our purpose to live and to give our gift to the world. In other words, the fact that humans embody purpose, and not only humans, but life itself, results from the emergence of purpose coursing through evolution itself as a kind of current that's animating the entire project. I think that we can't help but recognize that the purpose of the universe is directly related to our individual purposes, right? That the part and the whole are not identical, but by examining the part and reflecting on it from a spiritual perspective, it's possible that we can come to know at least part. We can get hints or sense of direction. The term purpose, of course, is directly related to a lot of other terms which are relevant to this inquiry, like why is there something rather than nothing, right? What is the meaning of the universe? What is the value of the universe? What are the needs of the universe? These are all related in a meaning cluster to the word purpose. I embrace the word purpose because of my own spiritual convictions, but I know that many people are uncomfortable with it, not just atheists, right? Because the term purpose implies intentionality, right? What's the intention behind the universe, which is pregnant with the assumption that the universe was created by an intentional being. And of course, that is something that is theologically disturbing to a lot of people, not just within secular frames, but also within a progressive spirituality, right? If your approach to spirituality is non-attachment, right, and just witnessing, if you are influenced by, for example, Bertrand Russell, the philosopher who said the universe is just there and that's all, don't ask why, or don't try to make an anthropocentric projection on the universe to the fact that we have purpose, we think there must be some larger purpose. But I refute that analysis and think that indeed we do embody the universe from every level of emergence, from the hydrogen debris of the Big Bang in our water molecules, up through the periodic table, through the evolution of life, through the evolution of human consciousness and culture. All of these accomplishments, all of these levels of emergence, in some ways are online and functioning in ourselves, in each individual person. Every person is a microcosm of the whole in some very profound and spiritually meaningful ways. And if we recognize that we are intentional beings, we do have purpose, and indeed our happiness and well-being is directly tied to the exercise of that purpose, then it's natural to ask, what is the purpose of the universe? So this is a conclusion that I reach in Evolution's Purpose and the Presence of the Infinite. And it's a conclusion that I like to walk people through, right? In other words, I don't just try to blurt out the thesis in any kind of way that's carefully argued. I mean, I'll do it for you, Emanuel, but I just want you to know that this is something that I carefully argue in my books, and it's not just something that I assert. Indeed, the assertion of a spiritual belief system, I mean, that's certainly what most spiritual teachers are doing, and I don't begrudge them the right to say what they think. But
I will say
that we want to go beyond. Evolutionary spirituality wants to go beyond just competing belief systems. We want to try to forge an agreement about what's spiritually real that can be appreciated by people who hold somewhat different spiritual convictions.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so,
you do a wonderful
I want to get to the purpose of the universe. I'm building up to it, but go on.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, your writing is so respectful of, other beliefs, and you build it slowly. So I think we all really appreciate how you've done that, and leading up to this that you're going to tell us here today. Go ahead about it.
Right. Okay. So we know what our purposes are. We can feel the phenomenology of purpose within us, right? It's sort of a spectrum. We can feel the urge to survive and reproduce that we share with our animal cousins, right? That's a purpose that all life has, the purpose to survive and reproduce. We can feel that that purpose is going up through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? As we have a purpose to take care of our safety needs, our social belonging needs, our esteem needs, and as we grow spiritually, increasingly our self-actualization needs. So we have these purposes within ourselves. And these purposes are, in a sense, to make things better, right? To increase our well-being. And as we become wise, we realize that increasing our own well-being is directly tied to our ability to increase the well-being of others. That is, the gifts that we give to the universe, the little ways in which we make the world better and are useful to our fellows, these are directly how we fulfill our own personal purposes and how we achieve gradual degrees of our own self-actualization, right? So we want to know what the larger purpose is of the universe. The first step is to look to what the universe is doing. The universe isn't just being, it's doing. The universe is evolving, right? We could even say that the universe is evolution happening. And so evolution is starting, of course, with the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. Like I said, the debris of the Big Bang are just hydrogen gas. But hydrogen gas complexifies, it diversifies, it becomes more inclusive, it becomes more accomplished, it builds on itself. And we sort of see the universe doing this for billions of years. And we can see how this structure of emergence that goes through cosmological evolution, biological evolution, and now through the continuing emergence of these levels of psychosocial evolution, we begin to see that the universe is, in a sense, it has a purpose because purpose is surging through it. That is, what separates life from non-life is that life has the purpose to survive and reproduce, as I mentioned. It's this momentous emergence of purpose within life that makes it so amazing. It makes it kind of a second Big Bang. Lynn Margulis, the famous evolutionary biologist, right. She spent a whole book saying, what is life, right? And their life is this and life is that. And her final conclusion from a scientific materialist point of view is that life is matter that chooses. So the idea that life is choosing, that it has a purpose, that it can fail to achieve its purpose, begins to show that the purpose of the universe is arising within it. It's sort of an autopoietic purpose, if you will. And that same purpose that's arising with us, we're now getting to the point in our own cultural evolution where we begin to see how, this is not just a particular individual purpose. This purpose that's surging with us is partaking of a universal purpose. And again, as I carefully argue, this universal purpose is the universal purpose of the finite evolving universe is to create a domain wherein perfection can be freely and originally recreated and reestablished by creatures themselves. In other words, if we look at the universe as a place where the finite, where things have been removed, things have been withdrawn. This is sort of a little bit similar to the Kabbalistic idea of Simsum, where it's creation by subtraction, right? So this clearing in the larger infinite universe where time and space exist, I think the purpose of this creation of the finite universe is for individual creatures to be able to rediscover what is perfect, what is more beautiful, more true, and more good, according to our own lights. In other words, we're finding these things, these greater steps of perfection aren't being handed to us. They're not pre-given. We get to decide by our own lights what's relatively more perfect. Now, that doesn't mean that the purpose of the universe is a simple upward escalator to the good, right? That which constitutes more perfect, that which constitutes more beautiful, true, or good, is framed by human worldviews which are animated by existential human problems. So we can only know the horizon of perfection or the full complement of what's good relative to what's bad, right? We live in this incomplete universe, painfully incomplete. We live in a universe of trouble and suffering. And so part of our purpose, part of the purpose of us being in the universe to fulfill this larger purpose is to overcome this trouble and suffering and help bring about a world that works for everyone. We may not be able to achieve that in our individual lifetimes, but I think that if we understand that purpose itself as a value or as a direction in the universe is best understood through the philosophical concept of an interdependent polarity, right? Like the entire universe, being and becoming, infinite and finite, creates this existential polarity. And that same structure is refracted, right, throughout the universe. Wherever we're looking at value, wherever there's an opportunity to move in the direction of the more perfect, we find this polarity of part and whole, in a sense, refracted there in its sort of self-similar or fractal existential reality. So what I mean is, purpose is both universal and particular. And that these two, recognition that there is a larger purpose of the universe, and that there is finding our own soul's purpose in life, that these things have a relationship of challenge and support, right? Or ways in which they each are interdependent. If we want to know our own purpose, we want to energize ourselves to have the power to pursue that purpose, then contemplating and trying to tune in to the larger purpose of the whole and comparing our own purposes to that whole trues up our purposes, right? But it can energize us. But in the same way, if we want to know what the larger purpose of the whole is, the best evidence we have, the best teaching and instruction we have about that is the highest reaches of our own purpose. Right? So this is something that Plato understood 2,500 years ago. So the purpose of the universe, I think, is to grow spiritually and to do it in ways that are achieved by free will creatures like us. And so the exercise of our own free will to make the world a better place through the beautiful, the true, and the good is a frame that tries to take this radical cosmic in speculation and bring it into something that is, at least we could point to some evidence for.
Yeah. Well, it certainly is, and it's very inspiring the way you describe it there, and certainly I see that, how that is so applicable to everyone, their own purpose, getting motivated from that. I'd like to just touch a little bit on this idea of the interdependent polarities, and you've said that that is really what drives evolution itself, that there's this kind of yin and yang, these two different forces, thesis, antithesis, Hegelian terms, and the synthesis coming out of that, which is the driving force of evolution. Perhaps in other words, that means if we're having a bad day, don't worry, it's just going to counterbalance with our good day and drive our evolution forward. But would you like to comment a little bit more on this absolutely fascinating dynamic interaction of interdependent?
Sure, absolutely. Well, in evolutionary spirituality or integral philosophy, however we want to frame it, one of the key areas of focus is on values, how values, in a sense, pull evolution forward, how we're attracted to that which we perceive to be a more perfect state. You know, we're moved by emergent ideals of morality, by that which is more true. Right? These are lures or forces that are impacting evolution through their influence on consciousness. Right? So there are many ways to talk about what's driving evolution, and I wouldn't want to reduce it to polarities being the drivers. That's kind of overstating the matter. But in our analysis and understanding and our kind of spiritual dwelling with the nature and the dynamics of values as they influence consciousness, and our consciousness, especially now in the realm of culture, is the driver of evolution, right? And there's cultural evolution usually only gets better when people try to make things better. But it's not natural selection, it's actual selection. We're actually trying to make things better. And if we don't try, things usually don't get better. So that's, in a sense, we're driving evolution. But as we work to drive it, as we work to fulfill our own purposes and to make the world a better place, we notice that values are like forms of spiritual energy, right? Just like the solar energy is one of the drivers of the biosphere. The energy of the beautiful, the true, and the good. The energy of intrinsic value is, in a sense, an energy source for the evolution of culture. And when we look at value and its dynamics, values, we notice that there's certain kind of technologies that we can discover, right? The characteristics of value, when worked with appropriately, can create more value, right? So there's a whole variety of technologies associated with integral philosophy. One of them is this the dialectic, as you mentioned, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, how that's a sort of a pattern which evolution seems to follow in many different levels. We can also recognize the technology of the beautiful, the true, and the good, how these sort of intrinsic values, these primary values, just like, three colors combined to make all the other colors in the spectrum. Getting to the most intrinsic values and understanding those as a practice is a form of values technology. And another one that's related, but for purposes of teaching is often best to break out, is this idea of interdependent polarities, which I mentioned a little bit. And the idea here is that values and things that create value, for the most part, tend to kind of cohere or manifest in interdependent polarities. So as I also mentioned, that these polarities are in a sense, a reflection of a larger structure of the universe as a whole. So they're kind of little birthmarks, right, or fingerprints of the larger structure. And so just to give some examples, right, we could talk about freedom and order, or mercy and justice, or competition and cooperation, or self and community. There's challenge and support. I mentioned these. These, in a sense, these realities are indestructible. Like competition and cooperation is a good one as an example, because within progressive culture, right, people see competition and cooperation, and they often proclaim cooperation good, competition bad, right? And that's understandable because modernity is so hyper-competitive, or so dog-eat-dog in certain circumstances, that one of the ways that progressive culture attempts to transcend modernity is by re-embracing cooperation and emphasizing cooperation, right? So that makes sense, and I applaud that. But because, according to this analysis, competition and cooperation are interdependently linked together, so that if we pursue cooperation at the expense of competition, where it's all about the group and the excellence of the individual, the relative achievements of the individual are discounted or overlooked or suppressed, this has a tendency to make the value-creating potential of cooperation diminish. In other words, cooperation as a way of creating value achieves its best results when it's in a relationship with competition, where there's a recognition that within cooperation, we still need individuals to strive for excellence, to outshine us all. But yet, even on the other side, within competition, if we eliminate all cooperation within this indestructible polarity, the potential for competition to create value is likewise diminished. And indeed, when an interdependent polarity, when one pair is completely separated from the other, it can create a kind of pathology, right? Like I mentioned, too much competition without any cooperation results in a dog-eat-dog environment that nobody wants to be in. But too much cooperation can create groupthink and this kind of stagnant, bureaucratic environment where the initiative and innovative results of individual striving and excellence are suppressed. So when we have the wisdom and the knowledge to know that when we find a value that we really are drawn to, it's always important to look for the complementary, the challenge and support of the polar pair that's often associated with that value. And it's almost like mathematics, you can reduce it. So if you find a general value, a general polarity, like in a company, you could say, well, marketing and accounting, that's a polarity. They're both creating value, but they're at odds with each other to a degree. Well, you can say, well, that's a kind of an expression of a more deep polarity, which would be the sort of outgoing and building and protecting, right? That's a more fundamental protector. That in any organization, you need people who are building it, and you need people who are protecting it. So this practice or this process of working with polarities is an entire subject that we could spend several hours on, teaching, giving examples, leading people through exercises. And indeed, there are consulting firms in the organizational development field who specialize in polarity management. So if people are interested in those on a professional basis, you can learn more about the techniques and all the different ways that they try to bring those to bear within organizational settings. But I think for purposes of just understanding that what goes with evolutionary spirituality is a kind of an embrace of a series of value technologies, we can begin to understand that interdependent polarities and the working with them, that's an important values technology that I would commend your viewers to explore.
Yeah, well, you've certainly explored it in great depth, and this dynamic you describe of ongoing balancing is certainly a very important element. And in fact, you've taken it one step forward forward and applied it probably to one of the most pressing issues of our times. You're the co-founder and president of the Institute for Cultural Evolution, and you've really taken these theories of interdependent polarities and others to put them together to really see how we can bridge some of the differences in society today. And we've got plenty of that. I think your work with cultural evolution and bringing some of our other polarities together, I think one of them is called Democrats and Republicans out there. That's an admirable undertaking. Can you give us a little bit on what you're doing at the Institute of Cultural Evolution, how this applies, and are you hopeful that we can make some cultural evolutionary progress here in some of our differences in society today?
Sure. Well, it's important to take stock of where we are in terms of the evolution of our culture, right? This postmodern or progressive worldview that we've been talking about, it's relatively new. It's only about 50 years old as a visible cultural structure that is pushed off against modernity. It's no longer a subset of modernity. It's kind of its own separate culture. And that in this process, we can see the mainstream establishment world, we refer to as modernity, as in a sense the thesis, and postmodernism as the synthesis. As the antithesis, right? It's defining itself by what's wrong with modernity, right? The environmental destruction, gross inequality, third world colonial exploitation, all of the crimes and shortcomings of modernity have created a kind of a low pressure space in the culture of humanity, whereby opportunities to make things better are defined by rejecting modernity, right? So that's an important move that can't be truncated or avoided, right? In order to get beyond this incredible world of modernism for good and bad, we have to start by rejecting it, right? By pushing off against it. And that's what the postmodern culture is. Those are the values that animate postmodernism, is that which is wrong with modernity, right? And that's an important step. But because that step is still relatively new in the scheme of cultural evolution, the next step, beyond the antithesis to a synthesis that can not just be against the modern world, but that can include its important accomplishments, honor it, preserve it, recognize how important it is, that's something that can't be done within the framework of the antithesis, right? The antithesis is concerned with the first step. We can't ask it to do the next step. But the next step, the synthesis that can bring together traditionalism, modernism, and postmodernism into a transcendent and inclusive new whole, a new cultural agreement by which we can reclaim political will and begin to address our meaningful problems, overcome the polarization that plagues our politics. That accomplishment awaits a kind of a synthetic understanding, if you will, and more inclusive than even the inclusive framework of progressive culture. So that's just beginning. We're just starting to grope our way beyond postmodernism now. There's not a lot of philanthropical support. There's not a market. There's hardly anything there. And so it's trying to create institutions that are representative of this synthetic or postmodern cultural space is a small pioneering effort. But we realize, my colleagues and I, within this interval philosophy movement, that the two areas where this new truth, because that's kind of what it is sort of a new truth about evolution and culture and consciousness, where this truth could do the most good at this time in history was its impact on spirituality and politics. So the books that I've been writing have been focused on spirituality. But on the political side, the way we thought we could try to make an impact and help contribute to the beginning emergence of whatever comes after the progressive postmodern cultural world frame began with creating a think tank. Now, a think tank is kind of it's a phrase we'd rather avoid, but we want to label what we're doing as something the media can understand, right? So we want to create an organization that can try to influence the influencers, right? The influence is the name of the game. And while our think tank, our sort of startup think tank, our boutique think tank, is not going to be able to put the next president in office, right? We're not going to have an outsized influence until we can get a greater realm of cultural agreement that can support us. So again, Institute for Cultural Evolution, we're writing, we're analyzing, we're holding conclaves where we bring together luminaries to talk about the future of politics, the future of the left, the future of the right. And we've been doing that since about 2013. We've had some modest success influencing politics, getting op-eds published in the mainstream media, bringing mainstream luminaries together for retreats. John Mackey, CEO of Whole Foods, has joined our board, but we're still not funded, right? We're still not, we still don't have the kind of resources that would be required for us to make a significant impact beyond where we're impacting now. But that's led to the next phase of the work of the think tank, which is to write one or two political books where we can put a kind of a cornerstone or a stake in the ground as to what we really are about. I mean, we have plenty of articles on the Institute for Cultural Evolution's website, which is culturalevolution.org, that people can read about our political approach. But at this point, it's still a kind of a boutique or a startup. And so this next phase is writing this book. It's going to take about another year, and then hopefully that will lead to the next round of funding and visibility in the society for integral politics.
Well, I certainly hope it does. You're a very brave man taking on religion and politics here.
Right. Doesn't make for a good dinner party discussion.
Well, I think the way you do it with your understanding of interdependent polarities and including and transcending, you're on the track. If anybody can do it, I think you can, Steve. So you've got quite a task on your hand there. I guess you're trying to write this book, shall we call it Integral Politics or Interdependent Polarity Peace Talks or whatever. I don't know. Do you have a title or a publication date, or is this still kind of in the planning stage?
Well, I appreciate your interest. I do have a title, but I'm not letting it out of the box just yet. And there's writing always takes much longer than you think. I mean, the amount of time that must be lavished on a book that you really care about, is ridiculous. You can't think about it as a strategic investment. It's got to be a work of heart and soul. In other words, if you want it to be good. So that's where I am with it. I certainly am motivated to complete it as soon as possible. But I think that the United States clearly is facing some huge political challenges. I think these challenges can be understood with greater clarity from the perspective of evolutionary politics. And I think that it's in some ways, in this realm of siloed social media, it's easy to be lazy in our political thinking and just allow the received rejectionistic point of view or the sort of the partisan hostilities that we encounter daily on social media and in the mainstream media. It's easy to let those just think our thoughts for us. But I think that if we're going to evolve our way out of this gridlock political situation, it's going to take a recognition, not just of the polarity of right and left. In some way, the thinking in politics in terms of red states and blue states is part of the problem, because it's more complex than that. The polarities exist not just within the Republicans and the Democrats. There's a polarity on the left and a polarity on the right. And working with the polarities, understanding that there are deep pieces of wisdom that we can extract from social conservatives and from fiscal conservatives. Even though I'm a progressive person, even though I consistently vote for Democrats, one of the things that evolutionary politics allows me to see is that the degree of our transcendence is ultimately determined by the scope of our inclusion. And that when we understand that we may be progressives, but that progressive set of values is ultimately related to a complementary form of values. I'm not saying that those values are represented by Donald Trump or by religious conservatives, but part of the practice of evolutionary politics is being able to tease apart the dignities from the disasters, if you will, to recognize that the things that we find abhorrent about the right wing, that indeed there are things that must be overcome and fought against, and not to diminish any of the urgencies of the situation we have with the Trump administration, but part of the way to evolve beyond it is to find those values that are on the right side, that are enduring, values that we're going to need, values that are going to be part of the permanent ecosystem of a higher level of civilization. And if we can value those values ourselves, if we can kind of extract from our opposition the values that we can begin to see that are necessary and right, then that will allow us to persuade our fellows in ways that will allow us to evolve beyond the polarity. Again, this is a complex form of argumentation and reasoning that can't really be reduced to a kind of a quick explanation. I can't fit it into a soundbite. Well, but I can say that integrating values is a practice, another one of these values technologies, and that's what we're working on to develop at the Institute for Cultural Evolution and in this next book.
Well, I think you're doing a great job of maybe not quite into sound bites, but I think our listeners can glean here the great deal of thought and research and steady, consistent approach to this that's gone into the whole thought process. So, I really think you're on the track there of providing us with a much needed service to our rather divided society today. We're going to have to wrap it up pretty quickly, but I'd just like to touch on one thing. You mentioned Lynn Margulis' definition of life as matter that it's choosing, and this idea of choice. And you've talked a little bit about free will, too, and that you've alluded to the idea that between biology and our socialization process, our culture, that kind of reduces our free will. And for our listeners here, as purpose moves forward and as we, reconcile these independent polarities and move forward, can we say it's true that maybe we gain a little access to free will, or we empower ourselves at least to make higher, better choices as this process moves forward?
Sure. That was Abraham Maslow realized that in the 50s, that self-actualized people are more free. They have more free will. They're less determined by monolithic cultural forces. So, as I explain in The Presence of the Infinite, the idea of free will could be a misnomer, right? Because the idea that we're just freestanding or that we're completely free of other influences, I think overstates the situation. Clearly, evolutionary biology shows how so much of what we think and our attitudes are based on these ancient genetic predispositions, right? So there's this determinism, biological determinism affecting us from below. And then, of course, none of us are completely free from the cultural influences in which we live, right? As we speak the language speaks us, right? I mean, our worldviews and our values are connected to these larger, historically significant cultural agreements that think our thoughts for us, for good and bad. So there's these huge deterministic influences from both biology and culture. But in between these major influences that are determining our thinking and our feeling and our behavior, I am committed to the idea, and I think we all, in a way, experience directly, that there is a modicum of freedom in between, right? That is, it's in a sense, the freedom itself is the indwelling gift of spirit that makes us moral creatures able to recognize what's relatively more beautiful, true, and good, right? That is, our free will is an organ of perception for intrinsic value. Because if you think about it, morality would have no meaning if we couldn't do otherwise. If everything was predetermined and we just were going along for the ride and we couldn't choose to do better or worse, then there's no such thing as morality, right? Morality is based on a choice. And that choice is based on the ability to have done otherwise, which implies a degree of freedom. So if we think about literally the freedom of our ability to choose as the thing which makes us sovereign spiritual creatures indwelt by a spirit of some kind, then that helps us see how that as we grow spiritually, that degree of freedom that we possess expands, right? That we become more free, we become less determined by our society, less determined by our biology, and more able to make a contribution to this larger purpose of the universe, which I spoke of, which is to make things more perfect by our own lights, right? So the more our own lights, the more self-determined we are, the more free we are to decide what's beautiful, true, or good, the more potent and powerful we can be in fulfilling not just our own purposes, but in contributing to the universe's purposes as a whole.
Yeah, so it's a kind of self-enhancing process then, as we're, getting more adept at moving forward from the interdependent polarities, driving our value system with truth, beauty, and goodness forward. We're kind of reinforced with this additional choice power to make ever better, higher, more frequent choices. Could we summarize it that way? Is this?
Sure, I'll go with that. Yeah, nicely done.
Well, that's very encouraging. And I mean, your message here is good news for all of us, that if we can better understand this and employ these tactics, why it's going to open up a whole new purposeful way forward, I think.
Well, let me just comment on that, because one of some thinking people object to the oversimplification of this idea that we're striving to create a better world, because the idea that that evolution or history is just an upward escalator to the good just seems too Pollyanna, right? That can't be the truth, because look at the Holocaust, look at all the horrible things that have happened in the world. How can we be moving toward goodness? And I agree that it's not that simple, and it's certainly not that linear. But what's important to take away is that we're emerging beyond the realm in which creatures were not responsible for their own circumstances. We are now thrown into this world where it's up to us, and if things are bad, it's because we've either created that pathology or we failed to overcome it. And so, working to overcome the problems of the world, working to try to alleviate suffering and make the world a better place, it can't occur in a direct way, because we're always trying to get away from the problems. It's a little bit like a sailboat tacking against the wind. It can't sail directly into the wind. It has to advance obliquely, which means that whatever worldview whatever set of values we may ascribe to, those values are molded by what's wrong. And so they're never complete. So the sailboat can only go so far in that direction of values within that worldview before it has to tack back and choose a kind of an opposite set. That's why we see this pattern of the dialectic. Right? The dialectic's like a river meandering in a floodplain, or a sailboat tacking back and forth. And that's why even the best intentioned worldview is still, in a sense, only partial. Can still only go in one direction, for it requires the remedy of its interdependent polar pair to challenge and support it into making further progress by another tack. Yeah. So, that's just a way of trying to moderate the idea that it's just, all roses and that there's no real trouble and suffering in the world. But that doesn't mean that we should be less than optimistic regarding our ability to make the world better, even in the small incremental ways that each of us are empowered to do in this short life.
Well, certainly with your brilliant work and this driving notion of truth, beauty, and goodness, and evolving value systems that will bring us together, it gives us a great deal of hope. And as you said, we all have to get out there and navigate. It's not a linear process. It's kind of a wave that our sailboats riding here going forward. But as we do so, how do you feel about the future? Are you optimistic?
Well, certainly, there are dire challenges that face us. The disruption of the biosphere through global warming, certainly has me freaked out. I try to gain perspective on it and not be pulled into the currents of declinism or declinism, right? This is a theme that's run throughout history, going back to Rousseau, right, during the Enlightenment. Right, you can see these prophets of doom have gained a lot of traction, and those who were predicting the inevitable decline of the West, much of those currents of pessimism have been joined by certain people, well-meaning people within the environmental movement, who are now declaring inevitable doom of the environment. And while I think that it's something we certainly have to be very concerned about and work for. In both political and cultural environments, overcoming global warming, in my view, is humanity's biggest challenge. But I think that we can't be complacent or get into despair. I think it's actually, we have a moral duty to maintain confidence that we can and will overcome it. Yes, the world will become warmer. Yes, some species will be extinct. Yes, we're in for a bumpy ride. But if we compare it to the 20th century, like World War II, right? 35 million people or more, 60 million people died during World War II. Europe was completely devastated. And yet that was a horrific setback to humanity that we overcame and has now made us stronger in some ways. And I see the challenge of global warming as being a similar challenge for the 21st century. But I don't think that taking a political and cultural position from the stance of anti-modernism is going to get us where we need to go. I don't think just scolding people and doomsaying regarding the environment is the most politically effective or strategically wise course of action, at least at this time in history. So I think that's why that the environmental movement needs to look in the mirror and gain a more evolutionary perspective about how they can be more effective at persuading those who need to be persuaded that this is a challenge that we need to build a political will to overcome.
Well, you know, Steve, with your kind of vision and your conciliatory approach to this and balancing things out, we're so grateful to you as being really one of the world leaders in this very unexplored, brand new territory of how do we live together? How do we counterbalance all these opposing forces and make evolution trudge on towards truth, beauty, and goodness? And really, I think you've set out some guideposts for that path more than anyone else, really. And I congratulate you for that and thank you for it and for sharing these ideas here today. Because
we're in this together, Emanuel. We're part of this. Is something that isn't just me, the writer. It's you, the activist, and us in this larger culture that we're striving to go beyond the antithesis to the synthesis. So, back at you.
No, well, thanks very much. And I certainly agree. We do have this moral obligation, all of us, to, not succumb to fear and, oh my gosh, but we just have to roll up our sleeves and find our true purpose, develop our will, get out there and get the job done. And certainly your whole life personifies that very message. So I really thank you for your time today and helping us better understand this whole process. I think you've got an event coming up in August with Jeff Salzman from the Daily Evolver.
This will be the third annual Integral Incubator Seminar. It's 3.5 days in Boulder, Colorado at the Integral Center. There'll be about 35 people, and we'll explore evolutionary thinking. We'll explore integral politics, evolutionary spirituality. We'll create a group container. We'll enjoy beautiful Boulder in the summer. We've tried to make it reasonably priced. So we invite your listeners to consider joining us in Boulder August 24th through August 27th. We've still got a couple of slots left in the seminar. And for people who are interested, the website for the Integral Incubator Seminar is integralincubator.org. Or you can access the seminar from my website, which is the headquarters of my work as a writer, stevemcintosh.com. And then we've also got a little bit about it on the Institute for Cultural Evolution's website, the think tank, which is culturalevolution.org. Those are the 3 URLs.
Well, very good. Thank you, Steve. And certainly I think our listeners will be encouraged to go out, look at your website, stevemcintosh.com, the Integral Incubator, find out more about your book. Steve is the author of 3 past books, Integral Consciousness, Evolution's Purpose, and The Presence of the Infinite. Some of the most timely, important writing of our times. He's an entrepreneur and a world-class thinker. Steve, thank you so much for joining us today, for the good work you're doing, for the purposeful soul you are, and the contribution to humanity that you're making.
Thanks, Emanuel. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate your interest and participation with us together in this new world we're trying to create.
Very good. Thank you, Steve. Steve McIntosh, our guest for today on Global Purpose Live. Just like to remind you, Global Purpose Movement will be present this month in July at the biannual IONS Conference, Oakland, California, July 20th to 23rd. We'll be doing a pre-conference session and some breakouts, bringing you more on the power of purpose and social change, all within the work of Global Purpose Movement. So thank you for joining us here today. Thank you once again, Steve McIntosh. This is Global Purpose Live, wishing you deeper purpose in your own lives. And thank you for joining us today. Bye for now.